Good day, we will now review this book called The Philippines Progress Prior to 1898 by Austin Craig and Conrado Benitez. Firstly, we will discuss the summary of the thesis or the main idea of this book, collection of various accounts, documents, historical records, and letters from different sources and points of views. It is also a collection of written works by other researchers and authors. Originally, the book was published in 2013. As the title of the book says, it is about the Philippines' progress during Spanish rule in the year 1521 and have occupied it for approximately 300 years until Spain surrendered the Philippines to the United States during the Treaty of Paris in December 1898. For each chapter it discusses what the Philippines was before the arrival of the Spaniards and how the life of the natives changed drastically in terms of livelihood, agriculture, trade, and economy. This book mainly talks about the political history of the Philippines and its development of the natives and their way of life, showing that it was not all about Spaniards who made such development happen but also the natives, the Filipinos. Its aim is to supply a fairer view of Filipino participation and add more detail to the Spanish accounts that may be one-sided to only their side that is centered around the Philippines during their occupation. Let's move on to introduce the author, including the author's title and place of work, and some indication of who the author is. The author of the book, titled Philippine Progress Prior to 1898, that me and my partner have chosen is written by Austin Craig and Conrado Benitez. Austin Craig was an American historian born in Edison, New York. He is one of the first to write a biography for the Philippine national hero known as Jose Rizal. In writing that biography, the Philippines named a street after Craig in Sampaloc, Manila. Austin Craig was educated at Cornell University, University of Rochester, and the Pacific University. On July 25, 1904, he arrived in Manila as a teacher working for the Bureau of Education and taking up position in Liubang Island, Calapan, Mindoro, and finally, Manila at the Philippine School of Arts and Trades, the Philippine Normal School, Manila High School, the University of the Philippines, and the University of Manila, 1922 to 1927. He became the first chair of Department of History of the University of the Philippines in the year 1910. Austin Craig was the Rizal Professor at the University of the Philippines, Padre Fora, from 1912 to 1922. This chair was awarded in recognition of his books on Rizal, the first being The Story of Jose Rizal, 1909, followed by Lineage, Life and Labor of Jose Rizal, Philippine Patriot, a study of the growth of free ideas in the Trans-Pacific American territory. He died in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on February 11, 1949. Conrado Benitez was a Filipino statesman, writer, and educator. He was the founder of the Philippine Rural Reconstruction Movement and was one of the drafters of the 1934 Constitution of the Philippines. Benitez was born in Pagsanjan, Laguna, on November 26, 1889. He studied at the Philippine Normal School and graduated as a valedictorian. In 1911, he was sent to the United States as a government pensionado and studied at the University of Chicago, where he received his MA and PhD. Back in the Philippines, he studied law at the University of the Philippines. He was a member of the Sigma Phi Brotherhood of Upsilon. In 1937, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt made him a member of the Filipino-American Joint Committee responsible for drawing up economic proposals in preparation for the country's independence. In 1938, he was named Deputy Executive Secretary to President Manuel Quezon. Next we will discuss the major ideas and supporting details per chapter. Chapter 1, Agriculture and Landholding at the Time of the Discovery and Conquest. This chapter talks about the following: agriculture, livestock, landholding. First is the agriculture. Before the Spaniards arrived in the Philippines, agriculture was already present and was rather prosperous. Rice was the main food source that the natives had, and until now is still present in every household. They also relied on sugar cane, coconuts, indigo, sweet potatoes, a variety of bananas, the tamarind, lanzones, and various types of vegetables as their food source. Not only do they consume them but they also grow and cultivate them. Next is the livestock. Filipinos during this time period already had the ability to raise animals that have been domesticated such as dogs, cats, pigs, goats, and buffaloes. Horses were not present during this era. It was later introduced by the Spaniards, which have been brought from China and Nueva España. The Spaniards' early accounts of expedition in Philippine soil was to find food, and it showed that chickens were already commonly domesticated. Moreover, in the early days, the system of irrigation of the rice fields used today was known and practiced. Of course, the so-called Canaan method of cultivation prevailed, but the considerable amounts of rice which the Filipinos contributed at various times to the benefit of the Spanish conquerors could not have been developed under such a primitive system of cultivation. And lastly is the landholding. Ancient Filipinos had lands that were divided among the whole barangay. Each one had his own land and no resident of one barangay was allowed to cultivate other lands in another barangay unless he has gained them from inheritance, as a gift, or through purchase. When the Spaniards came, however, lands were assigned to the colonists, who, after 4 years of residency, were to have permanent possession of them. Colonists were given encomiendas of the natives, which is the right to demand tribute and forced labor that is granted by the Spanish crown. It is in connection with the administration of these encomiendas that we find several accounts of violations and extortions practiced on the natives, and the ensuing revolts, in the annals of the Philippines. However, it must not be assumed that the Filipinos were simply dispossessed by the king of their lands, for, while the land and the soil in all colonies were the king's property according to the constitutional law of the Indies and could therefore be given to deserving persons, there were royal decrees intended to protect the natives in their time-honored possession. Let's move on to Chapter 2, Industries at the Time of Discovery and Conquest. This chapter discusses the following: shipbuilding, fishing, mining and metalwork, textile industries, miscellaneous industries. First is the shipbuilding. Although the ancient Filipinos used to be a seafaring group of people, due to Spanish occupation, their knowledge of seafaring and shipbuilding are gone. The Spaniards took advantage of this country's surplus of materials, and engaged in shipbuilding on a wide scale. Even though the Filipinos still made ships, these ships however were of European design. Shipyards were set up in different locations, and the Filipinos were forced to go and work for them. To Spain's honor and glory, some of the largest ships in the world were constructed in the Philippines at that time. Filipinos suffered by building ships and also being one of the oarsmen who are present in the ship that was built. Considerations should be given to the many lives lost in connection with the construction of ships. The effect on the country's factories, then, was devastating. Moreover, the workers were not paid their salaries very much. Even worse than the physical brutality perpetrated on them, not only did the Filipinos assist the king in the growth of his kingdom, but also those who directly exploited them in order to become wealthy. Therefore, it is not unusual that we should find decent people, including the earlier religious men who wrote to the king and appealed for redress. It is clear now why many revolts have been caused by the shipbuilding industry. The migration of many of them to New Spain, and their settlement there, was an interesting result of the difficulties faced by the Filipinos. Second is the fishing. Next to rice, fish was the most abundant food source found in the Philippines and is considered an important part of the diet of Filipinos. Even before the Spaniards came to the Philippines, the fishing industry was already present and prosperous. Pearl oysters and other precious products of the sea was also a developed industry and was exported to other countries before Spanish rule. Third is the mining and metal works. Not only did the early Filipinos know how to handle mines, they also learned the art of working with metal. They made jewelry and all sorts of ornaments from the precious metals. They also used metal for some of their weapons. And their use of firearms was the most notable proof of their development in working metals. Fourth is the textile industries. Weaving was one of the industries that the Filipinos knew well even before the Spaniards arrived. Contemporary writers all speak of the great quantity of clothes woven in the country, particularly cotton. As cotton is raised abundantly throughout the islands, Sand says, all know how to raise cotton and silk, and everywhere they know how to spin and weave for clothing. The fibers of the abaca or hemp plant were also used for weaving in addition to cotton. In fact, the latter may have been used even before the former. They also wove cloths from pina and imported silk from China. The women knew the art of making lace and embroidery. And lastly, the miscellaneous industries. Among the other industries at the time of discovery and conquest were, the manufacture of gunpowder, the hunting and exporting of edible bird nests to China, the preparation of hides for export to Japan, particularly deer. As they possess many civet cats, although smaller than those of Guinea, they make use of the civet and trade it. They also carved the statues of their anitos. Let's move on to Chapter 3. Hundreds of years before the Spaniards ruled over the Filipinos, trade was already happening with the neighboring nations of China, Japan, Borneo, and others. According to the findings of Zhao Zhukua, a Chinese geographer of the 13th century, there is a section on Philippine trade, from which we discover that the foreign traders import porcelain, commercial gold, iron vases for perfumes, leaden objects, glass, pearls of all colors, iron needles, black damask, and other silk textures, fish nets, and tin, and furthermore silk umbrellas, and a sort of container woven from rattan. In exchange, cotton, perhaps kapok or tree cotton, yellow wax, strange fabric, coconuts, onions, camotes, and fine mats were exported by the Filipinos, pearls, shells of betel nuts, and textiles of jute. This chapter discusses the following. Domestic trade. Trade relations with Oriental countries. First is domestic trade. Spaniards who were the first to approach the Philippines witnessed a lively commercial relationship among the inhabitants of the various islands, and also with the neighboring countries. The key trading method was by means of barter, while gold dust was also used as a medium of trade. With the interference of the Spaniards, however, domestic trade was disrupted. First of all, trade restrictions were imposed, contact was limited between the villages. The spirit of restriction predominated until modern times, while later ordinances permitted freedom of trade between villages and provinces. The government officials then, although forbidden from engaging in trade in several decrees and ordinances, used their status as a means of earning income in trade. Until later days, this evil persisted. Nevertheless, as seen by Dr. Tavera, trading by the authorities was not without its positive effect. Next is trade relations with Oriental countries. Manila soon became the great distributing center of the East, due to the coming of the Spaniards, resulting in the opening of a new market to the products of the Orient. 30 to 40 ships from China typically sailed in March annually and reached Manila in 15 to 20 days, where the merchants sold their goods and returned, with the exception of some of the wealthier merchants, towards the end of May or during the first days of June to avoid traveling during the stormy season. Goods that have been brought by the Chinese were unloaded into the champans and then taken to the Parian or to other houses and magazines outside of the city, and there freely sold. No Spaniard, Chinese, or any other person was permitted to go to the vessel to buy or sell goods, food, or anything else. The purchase price was paid in silver and real, because the Chinese didn't want gold or any other objects, and they didn't want to carry any other items to China. Japanese and Portuguese merchants came from Nagasaki, Japan, bringing excellent wheat flour and highly prized salted meat. The majority of the merchandise was used in the country. Returning to Japan, they brought raw Chinese silk, gold, deerskin, and Brazil wood for their dyes during the months of June and July, also honey, manufactured wax, palm and Castilian wine, civet cats, broad timbers to store their tea, glass, fabric, and other Spanish curiosities. The Portuguese imported many products from the Moluccas, Malacca, and India, and in return took food, wine, crockery, and other goods needed there with them to the Moluccas, gold and money to Malacca, in addition to a few special trinkets and curiosities from Spain, and emeralds. Manila was also visited by smaller vessels belonging to the natives of Borneo, carrying well-made palm mats, a few slaves, sago, and tibers, large and small jars and excellent camphor. These articles were purchased more by the Filipinos than by the Spaniards. The Borneans brought wine and sugar, cotton cloth, and the Philippines other products with them. Let's move on to Chapter 4, Trade and Commerce, the period of restrictions. This chapter discusses the following. Restrictions. Effects of the galleon trade. First is restrictions. In the first years after the conquest, when the policy of restriction found its powerful supporters in the merchants of Cadiz and Seville, who, accustomed to monopolizing trade with America, looked jealously at the rapidly increasing prosperity of Manila, the new center of trade. Wealth had hardly been produced by trade. Those from Spain and Peru were underselling the cotton and silk cloths from China and Mexico, and a great deal of silver went, not to Spain, but to the East. Thus, the long-drawn-out rivalry between Manila, on the one hand, and Cadiz, and Seville, on the other hand, and America, as a third party, also served for her own sake. The phenomenon that dominated the Philippines for over 2 centuries was this commercial practice, and it had such a pronounced impact on its entire economic growth. Next is effects of the galleon trade. What were the effects of the galleon trade? This question has 2 responses. On the one hand, those who agree that the restriction policy was appropriate for the security of Spain's industries argue, of course, that such a policy was advantageous. Moreover, it is alleged that, during the early part of Spanish domination, no other economic activity could have been feasible because, at that time, there were no products of the country which would serve as the basis of a rich and flourishing trade. There was no capital sufficient to exploit the natural resources of the Philippines. And the prosperity of Singapore and Hong Kong is cited to prove that Manila was enriched by acting as a distributing point of Oriental goods. What prosperity would these cities enjoy if it were not for the fact that they were acting as Eastern interpots? The very preservation of the Philippines depended on its ability to sustain itself in part, and this was made possible by the income from trade as a whole. The galleon trade, on the other hand, absorbed too much attention from the Spaniards and caused the Philippine extractive industries, especially agriculture, to be neglected. It attracted the Spaniards to Manila, leaving the rest of the country without the profit of any good they could have done, and the point was reached in Cebu when, at one time, there were not enough people to fill the offices of alcaldes and regidors, and it was appropriate to appoint a few boletes from Manila to the city. Finally, it only enriched the few, and the ensuing economic downturn dominated the population's growth. However, not everything is to be attributed to the influence of the galleon trade. A good deal of the abuse of the natural resources of the nation was due to the hatred of Spanish industrial activity. As Carraga describes the characteristic by saying that the 8 centuries of ongoing struggle to push the Moors out of Spain created a chivalrous spirit and a passion for risky undertakings, the discovery of the New World provided that adventurous spirit with a wide sphere of operation, and the subsequent emigration to the newly discovered lands depopulated the peninsula to such an extent that labor depopulated the peninsula. And lastly the Chapter 5, the 19th century and economic development. This chapter discusses the following. The Sociedad Económica de Amigos del País. The Royal Company. The opening of the ports. First is the Economic Society of Friends of the Country. The idea of Bosco was to make the Philippines self-sufficient economically and not dependent on Mexico, and this led to the creation of the
Sociedad Económica de Amigos del País,
or Economic Society. The society was auspiciously inaugurated in 1782, facing serious opposition on the part of many. It seemed, however, as if the ideas of Bosco were too advanced for his time, for until 1822, society led a declining life. This proved to be a strong source of income and was, at the same time, instrumental in putting vast tracts of land into cultivation. Second is the Royal Company. The second important event during Bosco's rule was the establishment of the Real Compañía de Filipinas, or the Royal Company, by royal decree of March 10, 1785. The chief object of the company was to establish commercial relations among the different colonies, and also between the colonies and Spain, to supply Manila with the products of Europe, and, in return, to carry to Spain not only the products of the Philippines, but also the merchandise coming from the Oriental countries. In order to help the company, all the laws and decrees which prohibited the importation of Oriental cloths into Spain, were repealed, and the products of the Philippines were exempted from all kinds of duties both in Manila and in Spain. The production of silk, indigo, sugar, cotton, and especially of pepper and other spices was encouraged by the company. It declined from year to year in spite of the special protection and privileges granted to the company. What were the reasons that contributed to the Royal Company's poor success? The indifference of the residents of the Philippines was among the minor causes mentioned, for, as Zuniga says, taught to obtain what is required for their comfort in New Spain, without any more work than sending a memorial once every year, it is difficult for them to engage in a business that is servile and vexatious, and, accustomed to exorbitant revenues, they cannot adjust to the gradual profits. Lastly is opening of the ports. In 1814, as a result of the liberalizing effect of the War of Independence that had just ended in Spain, it was stipulated that all the colonial ports still limited should be opened to international traffic and that foreigners should be permitted to enter and engage in commercial activities. Therefore, the restrictive colonial policy that had existed among the European nations had been swept away, and that Spain was the very layman. 39 Spanish shipping and trading houses were located in Manila in 1842, and around a dozen foreign houses, of which 7 or 8 were English, 2 were American, 1 was French, the other was Danish, while there were consuls from France, the United States, Denmark, Sweden, and Belgium. After the opening of Manila, the proponents of greater freedom were not happy with just one free port, as there were significant difficulties with the export of goods from places far from Manila. Items from the provinces of Ilocano, southern Luzon, Visayas, and even Mindanao all had to be brought to Manila and shipped from there. Let's move on to summarize the intended purpose of the book and how it contributes to improving academic life and operation and to the discipline of college planning generally. The intended purpose of the book is to make the development of the Philippines known, from different points of views and accounts that have been gathered throughout the years. Although the Spaniards were the masters of the Filipinos during their rule, Filipinos also contributed to the country's development. It is to shed light on it. Next is assess the author's use of primary and or secondary sources. The authors of the book were mainly using secondary sources. Describe the way the author approaches his or her topic, the rigor of the research and scholarship, the logic of the argument, and the readability of the prose. The authors raise their standing by adding some important events that are now written in history as evidence of the assertions that the book reveals and the truth that remain untouched for years, will make us reconsider what we should believe. In history, especially here in the Philippines, the media press can easily manipulate information for their own purposes. They used their knowledge and experience to preserve the happenings before the Spaniards colonized us, they claims. In each chapter of the book as well as the other articles and accounts that will be found at the last pages of book, which is the appendix that is listed in every section of the chapter. Next is evaluate the book's merits, usefulness and special contributions, along with shortcomings you think are necessary to point out. This book is very useful for us because this book contains the history of Philippines before the Spaniards colonized us. It also shows the beauty of our country before the Philippines' progress prior to 1898. And last but not the least is mention at least one memorable aspect of the book, so that at the end of class we will remember something distinctive about your book. Chapter 1, where landholding is present in the past. Ancient Filipinos had lands that were divided among the whole barangay. Each one had his own land and no resident of one barangay was allowed to cultivate other lands in another barangay unless he has gained them from inheritance, as a gift, or through purchase. This is the most memorable aspect of the book because nowadays some of our countrymen don't have a land in their own country. That's all, thank you for watching.